Let's talk a little bit about confined space, and this is probably the one area that Jeff and I were a little surprised about when the other class I taught, this got brought up with the drinking water folks. We're going to go through here. This is a lot of technical information. I'm going to teach you there's two different types. There's a confined space and there's permit required confined spaces. So we're going to have to go through some definitions. This is strictly OSHA related definitions through the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And I will tell you up front that nobody in VDH is probably qualified to go into a confined space because you may not have the right equipment necessary to safely enter this space. So there may be lots of questions generated. Please stop me as we go through here. What I'm doing today is just an awareness level training to get you thinking about those places that you may have to enter. Okay. So a confined space is defined as a limited means of entry and exit. One way in, one way out. It may mean that the entrance is at point A and 150 feet away or 300 feet away is the exit point at point B. Okay? Limited means of entry and exit. It's not large enough for a worker to, it's large enough for a worker to enter. Okay, so limited means of entry and exit, and it's large enough for somebody to get into. And it's not designed for continuous human occupancy. So it's not designed for you to go in there and work for an 8-hour work shift. Okay, so that's what a confined space is. It has to meet these three definitions. Limited means of entry and exit, large enough for a worker to enter, and it's not designed for continuous human occupancy. Here's examples of confined spaces. Tanks, manholes, pits. Think of Jiffy Lube, and a pit is like what somebody might be in working under your car. Shafts and sewers. Those are all examples of confined spaces, along with pump stations. Okay, so probably some of you in the drinking water, if you're going into pump houses and pump stations, depending on how they're configured, you may be exposed to confined spaces. A vault, if you have to go down in vaults, trenches, tunnels, ductwork, storage tanks. All right. So here's some big examples of stuff that we have seen, some of which I got from folks at VDH that said, is this considered a confined space? So this is a manhole. There's water down in the bottom of this, and you know, they may have to go down in there and do whatever they got to do. There's another tank. I don't know if you guys come across these types of things. Something a little bit different. There's no water in it, but it's considered a pit or a vault. Okay, another manhole. Okay, a well. This is a confined space, and we can't see the bottom. Pump house, pump station. Okay, so to get in there, we got to open that we take the wood door off. We go in. Yeah. Okay, so we've got all of our electrical equipment and that kind of stuff, and there's some issues with that too, but that's not this class. So we've got to look down in that hole that you can see on the bottom where the partial dome is. Go to the next page. So we got to go. Somehow the wastewater people, or the drinking water folks told me they got to go down there and inspect this. And this particular individual told me all they do is stick their hand down the hole and snap pictures because they're not going down in there because they're not comfortable. So you can take them. Okay. So is that considered a confined space? Yes. Like I said, there's two types of confined spaces. We defined what a confined space was, which is a non-permit required confined space. It's just a confined space. Now, a permit required confined space has all three categories that we talked about earlier, and it has one or more of the following characteristics. It contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. It contains material that has the potential for engulfment. It has some sort of internal configuration where the person going into it could be trapped. And there is some other recognized serious safety and health hazard. Okay? So that's what a permit required confined space is. So with all that said, this slide here, for those of you who may have the potential to go into confined space, if you get nothing else today, this is what you need to evaluate when you're looking at a space. Okay? We're at that pump house. Okay? That one we showed earlier. Does it meet the definition of a confined space? Large enough to enter? Yes. Limited means of entry and exit? Yes. Not designed for continuous human occupancy? Yes. Then it's a confined space. Okay? So it has to meet all three of those definitions. So in this particular standard, and means it has to be all three of those. So yes, it's a confined space. Now we have to determine, okay, if it's a confined space, is it a permit required confined space that requires us to do some atmospheric testing so we don't get overcome, or is it a non-permit required confined space? So now we have to determine, is there a hazardous atmosphere in that space? I don't know. Just looking at it, I can't tell you that. You got to have some pieces of machinery, or what we call a 4-gas meter, to test that space to determine if there's enough oxygen in that space for you to actually do your work and not suffocate. Or is there some sort of engulfment hazard? Think of a silo. Could all the stuff stored in silo come down on me? Is there a configuration hazard? Is there inward slopingly walls? How are we going to get out of this thing? Or any other recognized serious safety hazard. If it meets any one of those 4 criteria, it's now a permit required confined space. Okay? If it doesn't meet any of those, it's a non-permit required confined space, which means you can probably enter it safely if it's just the top 3. Large enough to enter and exit, or limited means of entry and exit, and not designed for continuous human occupancy. If any of those 4 categories, it has a hazardous atmosphere, there's engulfment hazard, it's configured strangely, or other serious recognized hazard, it's considered a permit required confined space. You can go to the next one. So, what do we mean by limited openings of entry and exit? That means it can be an 18-inch diameter hole. And you can get it, people can get into them. Okay? There's all kinds of techniques to go into them. It means you may have difficulty going in with self-contained breathing apparatus. If somebody were to go down in that space, it would be difficult to get them out. Okay? Or it may be difficult to get out if it's a large opening because we got other pieces of equipment in there. That's what we mean by limited openings for entry and exit. Well, let's talk a little bit about unfavorable ventilation. This is where it's going to get us in those wells and the pump houses. Does it have natural ventilation? Okay. Is there a lack of air movement inside that space that would create an atmosphere different than outside that space? Potentially. Okay. Is there a deadly gas trapped inside that space? I don't know. I don't have a 4-gas meter to test it to see what's going on in there. Is there decaying organic material that could off gas and produce a toxic atmosphere? I don't know. We got to look and see. Or is there not enough oxygen in there because of rusting or some other sort of chemical process. If you think back to that first pump house slide that opened up, there was a lot of rust going on inside that space. That would be my first, if it were me going in there, that would be my first, why is it rusting in here? Okay, is this space ventilated anyway? And what else is going on in here? So those are the things that you should be thinking about when you're going to look at your spaces to do your inspections. All right, not designed for continuous human occupancy. What does that mean? It means that it's designed to store something, enclose a process or a material, or to transport substances. It occasionally allows you to go in to do an inspection, but not to be in there for any significant amount of time. Dangerous conditions, that just means that, what are we going to do? What is going on around that space? What work is being done around it? How are we going to rescue somebody if there's an emergency in that place? And if we're cleaning or doing something in that space or around that space, is a bigger hazard being created? These are things you need to think about when you're evaluating those pump houses and inspecting different types of facilities. So what are the hazards of a confined space? We need to talk about those. Those are oxygen deficient atmospheres, which means we don't have enough oxygen. We've got too much oxygen, which could cause stuff to ignite and burn rapidly. We could have a flammable atmosphere based on what's going on in there. We may have a toxic atmosphere. Something's off-gassing, and we've got methane, hydrogen sulfide, a variety of different things that could be going on in there. What's the temperature extremes? That's another seriously recognized hazard. Is it too hot, too cold? Is there an engulfment hazard? And what about noise, slick, wet surfaces, and the potential for falling objects? All those can be encompassed into the hazards of a confined space. Okay. So how do we control that? Okay. Well, the first thing you got to do is I'm making the assumption that when you go out with drinking water and inspect these pump houses, that somebody else owns the facility. So somebody should be testing the atmosphere to make sure it's safe for you to crawl around in there, if you have to crawl around in there. If they don't know what you're talking about, and you don't have your little 4-gas meter to test the atmosphere, and I probably wouldn't go in it, okay? What you could do is put in forced ventilation, which means you're drawing fresh air in and ventilating the space so that you have enough oxygen. And there are some procedures to do that. Is there any lockout, tagout, or control of any hazardous energy that's required before you enter that space? What other types of hazards are in there that we may need to control before you get into the space? Do we need to use a respirator? Who are our rescue services? If we go into permit required confined spaces or identifying confined spaces, we've got to have rescue services. And then there's the whole training and education piece on how to enter confined spaces.